But joining me live now for a bit more on this, and don't worry, some policy issues as well, is Assistant Minister to the Treasurer, Michael Sukkar. Michael Sukkar, thanks for your time today.
Hi,
what
Tom.
about this sex ban? I think it's fair to say that Julie Bishop was, as we were saying, lukewarm on this. She mentioned the moral police initially. What are your thoughts on this call from Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, I think it's an absolutely outstanding change to the ministerial guidelines. There's no doubt that if you speak to anyone in corporate Australia or small business or out in the community, that the vast majority of them recognise that a sexual relationship between a boss and a staff member is not healthy for a workplace. And look, many of us would have thought and hoped that these sorts of rules could remain unwritten, but to the extent that issues such as these arise, I think it has shown, the Prime Minister has shown great leadership in making this change. It's clearly in line with community expectation, so I wholeheartedly support it. I can see no positive in a minister having a sexual relationship with a staff member. And really, Tom, the question now is for the Labor Party, importantly for Bill Shorten. I don't think he has answered whether he supports this change to the ministerial guidelines. Now, if the Labor Party, particularly Bill Shorten and other members of his leadership team, don't support this change to the ministerial guidelines, well, they should get out and argue the case as to why ministers should be able to have sexual relationships with staff. But the position they've taken to date has been pretty curious.
Look, it's a fair point. It's one that's being put to Labor as well and will continue to be. Just one more, though, on this rule from Malcolm Turnbull, because at the moment it doesn't apply to a minister having sexual relations with someone from a staffer from another minister's office. Does that make sense? There'd still be this similar power imbalance, would there not?
Well, no. I mean, the point here is, Tom, we don't want to get into policing people's personal lives. I mean, you and I know what goes on in Canberra. We don't want to be policing people's personal lives. However, if you are the employer, you are the minister who employs the staff, they are your employer. You have a duty of care for them, you have a duty of care for everybody in your office, and having a sexual relationship with a staff member is not conducive to a healthy office environment. And these are not private offices, these are offices, ministerial offices, for the benefit of all Australians. The Prime Minister is not asking for much here, and I think, as we've seen from the reaction over the weekend, the vast majority of Australians think this is a complete no-brainer. So there is a huge distinction, Tom, between having a sexual relationship with your own staff member compared to others who you don't employ. The distinction is quite wide in my view, and I don't see any equivalence between the two. So we don't want to police personal lives. However, ministerial officers and a minister who has staff that he or she employs, they should not be having sexual relationships with them. And I think the Prime Minister has shown outstanding leadership here. This is a question of values, and the Prime Minister has set down a very strong marker on the values that we expect in the coalition, and I applaud him for it.
Just on one other rule that's already in place to do with the register of members' interests, Barnaby Joyce did note that he had this free accommodation. He didn't know who it was from. Now, if you look at the rules at the moment, it does say you should declare if it's a conflict of interest. It doesn't actually say you have to declare who gave it to you. But does that make sense? If you're going to make clear a conflict of interest, don't you need to say who the person was who gave you something?
Well, Tom, I think the Barnaby Joyce spoke at length about this in the Parliament last week. I think he went through quite a detailed timeline, explained his rationale for doing it. I don't think I can add anything to it, partly because I haven't looked at it very closely, but I take him at his word that he adhered to not only the letter but the spirit of those disclosures.
But just on that principle, would it not make sense if you're talking about conflict of interest and you're getting something free of charge, people need to know who it's from?
Well, not necessarily in every case, Tom. I think you're trying to discuss a broad hypothetical and overlay it onto a specific case. So I'll be pretty careful to comment. I think what we should always do with any of these rules is ensure that people, ministers, individuals, members of Parliament follow not just the black letter of the rules, but also follows the spirit of the rules. And as far as what I could take away from Barnaby Joyce's comments last week, I think he acquitted himself of both of those.
Okay, I want to move on to tax within your broader portfolio. This company tax cut that you're trying to get passed in the Senate has changed a bit in the makeup of it. For example, Jackie Lambie being out. Are you getting a bit closer to getting the numbers here?
Well, Tom, it's a bit like reading the tea leaves sometimes with the Senate. I think what we've seen, certainly with the jobs growth last year, 403,000 jobs, many of those coming off the back, quite frankly, of our company tax cuts that applied to businesses with a turnover of $50 million or less, so really all small and medium enterprises. I think the Senate, I think Australians are seeing that these are not just theoretical things. When we say reducing taxes, making investment into Australia easier has a dividend for jobs, and ultimately we hope has a dividend for higher wages, it's not a theory. Australians are seeing that it's actually happening in practice. We've obviously seen some examples in the US as well. So are we inching closer? I hope so, Tom, but it's very, very difficult to predict or preempt what a relatively diverse group of crossbench senators may or may not do. We'll just keep trying. I mean, we believe in our economic plan. We know that it will provide dividends for Australians, it will provide dividends for Australian
just
business.
on those dividends, if I could ask, Minister, because there is talk about where the dividends go of this company tax cut. If you get the whole thing through, and you're talking about a company tax cut to obviously the biggest companies in Australia, do you have a message about what they should do with that, how they should pass it on?
Well, starting from the beginning, Tom, I mean, we've already seen dividends. The dividends are 403,000 new jobs. That's 403,000 Australians who have a job. I mean, that is the greatest dividend of all. And the Labor Party don't like talking about this, but 3/4 of those jobs are full-time. 3/4 of those 400,000 jobs are full-time. Now, my message to corporate Australia would be, of course, you've got to fairly treat your employees. I think in an environment with rising investment, an environment where people are fighting for where companies are fighting for the best employees, fighting to attract and retain the best people, that inevitably you see wages pressures increasing, and therefore, hopefully, wages increasing at a faster clip than they have been. So, my message, of course, would be to all companies, to all of corporate Australia, you do have an obligation to share these dividends with your employees, but in a sense I don't need to tell them that, Tom. They understand that, and as the economy picks up even more momentum generated by the coalition government, I'm confident that will happen.
Michael Sukkar, thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much, Tom.